So if everyone can take a seat. So I hope everyone enjoyed the weather, the picnic tables, JFK sailboats. It was kind of a good opportunity to kind of decompress from the presentations this morning. But again, pretty good stuff. I think we did build a good foundation. We're going to switch to ICD-10 and then talk some business informatics. So a really nice way to round out the day. We will cap off the day just around 3 o'clock. So hopefully everyone can get on the road, avoid some traffic. Before then we'll have a raffle, so thank you for continuing to talk to the sponsors and their contributions. So right now I'm going to invite up Melissa Myatt to do the introductions.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Mio from Max IT Vitalize Consulting, an SAIC company, and I have the pleasure today of introducing Karen Machuca from Deloitte Consulting. Karen is a principal in the healthcare provider practice of the Boston office of Deloitte Consulting. She also serves as a Northeast lead for the healthcare provider practice. And Karen has over 20 years of experience in consulting to the healthcare industry, which includes revenue cycle, transformation, ICD-10 remediation, shared services development, technology-enabled process design, patient accounting, and ERP system implementation, as well as merger integration. So with all, we could all give her a round warm of applause for her to come on.
So thank you, Melissa, and thank you all for inviting me to speak to you today. I realized ICD-10 after lunch. What a topic. Thank you, Peter. Like everybody I know is going to stand up and do the happy dance. But the good news is, because of this view behind me, I know that you'll all be looking this way. So I'm happy about that. Last night when I was thinking through what I was going to speak about with all of you and realized that we're in this lovely venue of the JFK Library, I started to think about some of the things that JFK had said over time. And one of my favorite sayings of his is his comment that he made about the space program, which was, we do these things not because they're easy, we do these things because they're hard. And I thought, wow, he could be talking about ICD-10. How much harder could this get? In rest time frame, loads of money that we don't have to spend, just like the space program. So I thought with that as a backdrop, this is actually a perfect venue for this discussion. And I thought also what I would try to emphasize today is the fact that as IT professionals, I'm sure that you're all tired of being beaten around the head and shoulders about the fact that ICD-10 is an IT problem. My personal opinion is it's not. I think there's a lot of things that are sort of foundational, nuts and bolts, things that have to get done from an ICD-10 perspective. But as we've gone through the past couple of years, actually, we started doing work with ICD-10 literally years ago. We did some of the education for CMS. We helped them write some of the protocols and policies in CMS. So we've been involved in this from the very beginning. And we've been very, very involved on the payer side as well as the provider side. And what I would tell you is that while there's a lot of sort of tactical, block and tackle foundational things that you have to do to be successful with ICD-10, what really is going to make the difference as we've gone through this is the things that you see on this page. And that's adequate and accurate financial modeling about what the likely outcomes are as you move from ICD-9 to ICD-10, working very closely the payers and the providers in collaboration to do testing even now before things are really ready to go, and I'll talk a little bit through some ways to do that. And then testing not within the walls of the provider organization, but more importantly with all the trading partners that the private providers are involved with, and extensive testing with the payers. So while that sort of starts to head over towards the IT side of things, I would say that the keys to success versus just getting things done really surround more the finance and documentation areas than anything else. So if you look at the regulatory timeline, we used to talk 2, 3, 4 years ago, we talked about using ICD-10 to create a strategic advantage for your organization in the marketplace. And we used to talk about how you could use it to get data well in advance and start negotiating more favorable managed care contracts. We used to talk about how you could use that clinical data in advance if you started dual coding in advance for many other things that would make you great in the marketplace. Well, if you look at this timeline, basically we're up against it, and so hence the topic of this talk, which is preserving value. I don't think at this point anybody who hasn't started or isn't extremely far along the path can really create value through ICD-10 anymore. It's more about how do you sustain what you have and not lose, primarily from a reimbursement standpoint in the short term. If you look at where this line is, the line is probably a little bit too far to the left. It should be a little bit more towards the middle of 2013. Whoops, except that I didn't change the slides, so you can't sit. Never mind, I'm on the wrong side. I never drive my own slides. So if you look at, relative to the 2014 deadline that we looked at and look at how the market is progressing, this is an overview nationwide of where the market is. What you'll see is that health plans, by and large, are the farthest ahead. This is from a commercial perspective. If you look at some of the Medicaid, managed care, et cetera, they're not really in that same place. They're more in the state health and government bucket, which is yellow at best from a planning and assessment perspective. The providers are starting to do some of the planning that needs to be done. If you look at the mobilization, I think this is where the scariest piece is, because you've got federal and state, which represent a huge amount of reimbursement to all of the providers in this room, and by and large we're seeing red across the country. So some of the plans that we're hearing from some of the states, for example, is that they're just going to make lump sum monthly payments to the providers that basically resemble their typical historic monthly payment. So you can imagine what kind of havoc that would wreak on the AR, since you can't tie it to any specific patient account or adjudicate any specific claim or resolve the AR. We saw that happen in a small way at the beginning of this year in Massachusetts with HISNO, when HISNO asked all of the providers to stop submitting claims as they did their system upgrade, and everyone was still trying to recover from that little episode. So multiply that, take that from HISNO and take that to all state and all federal, and the picture gets kind of ugly. By far the farthest ahead are the health plans, and again, they started a long time ago. Many of them have their own mappers that are different from GEMS, but similar to GEMS, but they based on their own patient population that they cover and based on their reimbursement methodologies and what they hope can or can't happen moving forward. And life sciences haven't even started. I would say from that perspective, it's probably less concerning, except for in some of the areas like medical devices, where the need for data to be given to providers to be able to bill appropriately and at the appropriate level of care is a pretty large data set that typically is not transmitted from manufacturers to providers at this point in time beyond what normally is listed on the purchase order. So what I think, though, in terms of Massachusetts, is we are way farther behind than the country. And that's becoming really apparent as we go around and talk to different provider organizations, many of whom haven't even started their assessments in this state. The payers in this state are getting very nervous, and they're coming to us as consultants and saying, what the heck are the providers doing? Are they going to start? Are they ever going to do anything? And so I think there's part of that is just some of the complexity around all of the academic medical centers that we have here and the pressure to get the EMRs in place to hit the meaningful use stage 1 and stage 2 attestation dates. But the reality is that now we're on a collision course between meaningful use and ICD-10, and we really have to get started. A lot of the small freestanding hospitals have done nothing, and I think they're just kind of hoping that they can ride on other people's infrastructures or be acquired before it's too late. So, like I was saying to somebody, prayer isn't really a good strategy, but it seems like we've got a lot of praying going on in this marketplace. So the question is, where is your organization? You know, the 2013, as you can see, where we would expect you would need to be right now is fairly well into the implementation and remediation, and really pretty far along in not necessarily testing, but your testing strategy and which organizations you want to collaborate with in terms of payers, and starting to pull together a native data set that represents your organization and your patient population versus using data sets that are just available in the marketplace as a test case. What I would say is planning and assessment, you know, for the most part, I would add another phase after planning and assessment, which is the phase that I feel like most organizations are in right now, which is called generalized paralysis. And part of that is because when we see the vast remediation plans that are coming out of the assessment phases, they're just daunting. I mean, I have one client who is using another firm to do the ICD-10 assessment, but he showed it to me the other day and he said, "Can you believe there are 550 separate projects on this org chart that have to get done, and we need 800,000 hours of time to get it done? What are we going to do?" And the reality is that that's not an isolated incident, and that's probably what most remediation plans look like. But the key, I think, is at this point where we are, if you look at 2013 to 2014, is really not trying to do it all, but prioritizing the high-risk areas. And that's where some of the financial modeling and the testing come into play. Because you really can't do it all, you need to do enough to be able to mitigate the risk around reimbursement. So if we look at strategies and actions, this is where the audience participation part comes in. I've got a couple of these audience participation things. If you don't participate, we can get done a lot faster, but if you want to participate, that would be great. So show of hands. First, how many provider organizations or people or representatives from providers do we have here in the audience? So probably only a third. So for everybody else, can I just give me some examples of, do we have any payers here? Manufacturers? IT? Professional organizations? What is this whole section of the room over here? Staffing, things like, okay. So if there are things here that you want me to go faster through, also just tell me, because this is a very provider, I work in the provider industry, so this is a very provider-centric presentation. But so of the providers, the few of you, how many of your organizations have not started planning yet? Okay, that's good. So the key thing for, if you have any friends that haven't started planning, is just get started and truncate the planning. So, you know, I think a lot of places think that you have to go through this massive assessment, and it used to be that we had to go through and tear apart every single IT system in an organization and figure out what the remediation plan is. The reality is that at this point, that information is widely available in the marketplace. The information about who, what different software vendors have in place in terms of plans to get to an ICD-10 compliant version is widely available. So you don't have to do that sort of, you know, research on every single system anymore. And in terms of work planning, budgeting, those types of things, it's easy to kind of, you know, generally ballpark. I mean, I can tell you right off the top of my head, if it's a one facility organization, it's going to be $8 to $10 million. If it's, you know, 4 to 5 to 6 and it's academic, it's going to be $30 to $40 million. I mean, it's just, those ranges are readily available from a budgeting perspective. I think the key is sort of figuring out where that money needs to be spent, whether it's on contracts or whether it's labor or things like that, and where you can leverage other things that are already in flight. So for example, I always tell my clients, physicians see zero value in ICD-10. They feel like you're already making their lives way more difficult with these EMRs that they never want to hear about, and that it's creating more work for them to put all this information in. And now you're going to tell me that I have to become a coder? No way. So what we've been trying to do with our clients is they're implementing the EMRs to hardwire as much as possible of the information that's needed in the clinical documentation to be able to make sure that the physicians don't have to think too hard to get the right information on the page for the coders to be able to select the right ICD-10 code. So things like, that they don't typically write on things, if it's right-left, give them a checkbox or a drop-down for right and left. If it's approach and they have to tell you it's percutaneous or it's, oral or whatever the approach is, give them a drop-down right in the documentation so that they don't have to think through that, because if you look at the impact on a cardiologist, for example, the typical cheat sheet in a cath lab right now is about 1 to 2 pages long that tells them the right things to put down to pick a code. If you did the same type of cheat sheet in a cath lab, it's a book. It would be well over 40 pages, and they simply can't retain that much information, nor should they have to be able to put that information on it. But you need it for the code and you need it for billing. So make it as simple as possible and leave those 1 or 2 things to their discretion that need to be things that they need to think about and put into some sort of dictated note or free text, that type of thing. So to the and the reason I mention that is that physicians see value in good clinical documentation that they believe will lead to better value in terms of quality outcomes. So if you build it into what they theoretically value versus doing your EMR implementation and then saying, okay guys, now we're going to redo the documentation for ICD-10, or oh, now you got to start doing all this for ICD-10, they will balk, they'll never do it. So I think it's important to find things like that you can piggyback on for ICD-10. Okay, so how many have paused or slowed their implementation based on the delay? If you didn't raise your hand, you're lying. This is really where the market is, and I think everybody hoped, oh, maybe they'll make it 2015. Oh, maybe they'll just won't make us do this and we'll go straight to ICD-11. But the reality is that they've put a stake in the ground. It's not changing, and I think the real reason for that is, I think there is an appreciation of everything that's going on right now in terms of technology and change in healthcare and the millions and millions of dollars it's costing. But there's so much in the ACA legislation that that hinges on ICD-10 in terms of the quality outcomes measures and the payment bundling, that it's almost like if we don't get it done now, it stretches everything else out in the ACA, which, who knows where that's going to, because given how much that's going to cost, and probably that ACA isn't sustainable, but that's the train we're on right now, and that's probably a presentation for another day. So the one thing though, just to really, if you have slowed down, just refresh and get started again. I think one of the things that people are finding at risk now are their budgets, and the budgets that had been estimated when they originally did their planning and assessment, but have now gotten consumed by post-live stabilization from their EMR and patient financial systems implementations, other surges towards meaningful use and that kinds of thing have put the budgets at risk for ICD-10. And it's not a place to shirk on money. And some of the places where we're finding, especially, that the budgets are starting to go up is no surprise around coding. So the average salaries for coders are inching in many markets up to $125,000 a year for a HEMA-certified ICD-10 coders. I actually have primary care physicians I've talked to who have said they'd make more money as a coder, and that might be a good alternative career. So that's getting to be a place where the budgets are really going to be at risk. And the other thing we're finding is that for organizations that are trying to lock in coders and either temporary labor or in their outsourced coding operations, that we're seeing significant 30 to 40% increases in the rates in those new contracts. And also, many of the outsourced organizations are only willing to commit 3 to 4 coders to any given organization at this point in time, locked in at those rates. So that's a place to really think about where are you going to get those people. It's going to be almost impossible to survive the ICD-10 environment without some sort of a computer-assisted coding, and dramatically changing the coding approach and the coding staffing to be more of a validation type exercise with basically subject matter experts reviewing what's coming out of the computer-assisted coding. The precursor to that, of course, is the EMR that needs to be fully automated, and all of the notes, orders, and documentation need to be automated to be able to use computer-assisted coding. So that's another contingency that you need to think about, but that's given that coding, documentation and coding drives reimbursement and nothing else, that's really a critical thing to think about. So I'd say for those organizations who have continued their momentum throughout the whole thing, and there are some, there aren't many, but there are some. I think one of the big advantages there is to increase the testing timelines and increase the time available for gathering a natively coded data set that you can use for testing. So we're basically encouraging everybody to be in testing no later than April of 2013. That looks like a really long time away, but when you figure that some of the ICD-10 compliant versions of the software that many of you are on is not GA yet, and potentially won't be GA until early in the fall, maybe late in the fall, that testing time frame starts to look very, very, very compressed. So to the extent that you can accelerate some of your training and education and start to work on coding in ICD-10, the dual coding, ICD-9 and ICD-10, so that you can see where your DRG assignment might fall based on your current documentation and what the yield is when you turn it into an ICD-10 code versus an ICD-9. And then you can start working on figuring out where the gaps in documentation are, where you need additional training, and you can also start to get a data set pulled together that you can use for testing with any of your external training partners and any payers that you want to collaborate with. So, and that's not an insignificant effort and probably needs to start as soon as possible. And the reason is that you don't want to rely on a set of test data that a payer or somebody gives you that may not represent what would actually be yielded when you do your own documentation, or that doesn't represent your data set. One of the things that we are finding though, if I look at, I'm going to skip this page for now, we can come back to it, but one of the things that we're finding as we do the financial modeling is that right now there's an opportunity, and this has been pretty consistent across the country, that if you do that model data set and do the cross-mapping from your current ICD-9 to the ICD-10 codes, it looks like an uptick in most organizations of about 1.3% in revenue, in increased net revenue. So that comes back to one of the reasons that I think it's important to start doing that native coding right now is to make sure that the documentation is in place to yield that. So when we do a cross-mapping exercise, literally all we're doing is taking the ICD-9 code and plotting it against the likely ICD-10 code. That doesn't mean that that's the ICD-10 code that would result if you actually looked at the clinical documentation, coded it, and figured out which one was substantiated in ICD-10 by that documentation. So I think we all know every time the government gives you a little gift, like a potential to improve your reimbursement, they take it away really quickly. So I think if you want to take advantage of that window, because they will close it, they'll change the rate schedules, you know, as soon as they figure out everybody's getting paid more money. So they, I think it's important to make sure that you're out of the gate doing it correctly. So if I had said originally the things that are important to do is financial modeling, the payer-provider collaboration, and the testing. So if I look at financial modeling, really this is, you're going to get these slides later, I'm not going to go through every single thing on this slide. But basically the important things in financial modeling is, the only thing that's on this page that really is sequential is getting to that, oh, you know what, I should not be in charge of this. So where was I? Okay, so this looks like a sequential slide. It's not a sequential slide. The first 3 chevrons are important to be done. The fourth one, the payer collaboration, is really the only one that's a residual of the other ones. So the key thing here, and these sort of tie together between the financial modeling and the payer-provider collaboration, is you want to look first at what your potential impact looks like it's going to be on your reimbursement. There are many disciplines that are not particularly affected by this. Ophthalmology is not particularly affected. The key ones that are orthopedics, cardiology, neuro, spine, and OBGYN. Those are the ones where you see the biggest change, and it's because of the procedure codes, really, the addition of all the different procedure codes and having to substantiate why different procedures were done. But that's where the explosion in the code set is really in those areas, and it's where the biggest change in reimbursement is from with and without complications and different levels of morbidity, et cetera. So the key thing first is to start to look at what does the potential impact look like and what are the key I-9 codes from your perspective that are most at risk. And then to take that and look at which of your contracts are most affected so that you can figure out which payers you need to work with most closely to either change the, reopen the